Hello and welcome to People in Profit. I'm Charles Pellegrin. It's been 51 years since the French state last ran a budget surplus. Every lap around the sun since 1974, more money has left the government's coffers than has come in, which leads us to the situation we're in today. The country's public debt now totals 3.3 trillion euros. It used to be just over 30 billion euros in 1974. And France's public deficit is at 5.8% of GDP, about
Thousands of people have flooded the streets of France in massive protests, demanding immediate elections and calling for the removal of President Emmanuel Macron. Protesters accuse him of being the cause of the country's problems, blaming his leadership for the current collapse. The situation has escalated, with demonstrators shutting down businesses, torching government buildings, and even targeting restaurants. The message is clear: they want Macron out of power. One of the major grievances fueling the anger is France's loss of influence in Africa, especially in Niger. For years, France relied heavily on Niger's uranium, which powered a significant portion of the nation's electricity supply, about 65%. Since France's expulsion from Africa, citizens argue that this has contributed to energy challenges and deepened the crisis. Many believe Macron's foreign policies directly undermine the country's stability and resources. Adding to the unrest is France's staggering debt of around 3.3 trillion euros. The country is struggling to find ways to manage this financial burden, turning to the IMF for assistance and even appealing to Germany for support. Protesters see this as a sign of weakness and desperation, intensifying their calls for Macron's resignation. With debt piling up, energy resources cut off, and citizens in revolt, France faces one of its most turbulent moments in recent history.
Let me ask you, what would happen if every stolen coin, every looted gem, every drop of oil taken without consent, every ton of cocoa shipped away for pennies, every life destroyed by slavery and colonialism, what if all of that came back, not as whispers of history, but as a bill, a debt, a receipt? Today, that receipt has arrived, and it is stamped across the face of France, for $1 trillion in debt, for trillion. A number so massive it sounds unreal, but this is not fiction, this is not exaggeration, this is the roar of history, the thunder of justice, the payback of centuries. And the world is finally watching as France drowns under a mountain of debt it cannot climb out of, a mountain built from Africa's stolen gold, Africa's stolen uranium, Africa's stolen cocoa, Africa's stolen future. Let us tear away the lies. France did not become rich because it was clever. France did not become powerful because it was industrious. France became rich because Africa was robbed. France became powerful because Africa was shackled. And now, as Africa rises and breaks those shackles, France's empire is revealed for what it always was: a parasite living on the body of a continent it despised yet depended on for survival. Look closely at Paris today. Behind the glitter of the Eiffel Tower, behind the luxury boutiques, behind the polished speeches of French leaders lies fear. Fear that Africa has awakened. Fear that the colonies they once thought were dead memories are now alive, speaking, demanding, rejecting. Fear that their stolen wealth will never flow again. And as that fear grows, so does their debt, for trillion and climbing. Tell me, my brothers and sisters, is this not justice? Is this not the hand of history? Did France not think it could enslave millions, loot billions, colonize nations, and walk away without consequences? Did they not think Africa would one day rise, unite, and refuse to be their silent bank account? They mocked our independence, they controlled our currencies, they assassinated our leaders, they installed puppets, and they believed Africa would never resist, but Africa has resisted. Africa is resisting, and Africa will continue to resist until France is forced to admit a truth it has run from 4 centuries. Its empire was built on theft, and its collapse is built on justice. For $1 trillion, let us not see it as numbers alone. Let us see it as the screams of miners in Niger, forced into deathly uranium pits. Let us see it as the tears of cocoa farmers in Côte d'Ivoire, cheated by French corporations. Let us see it as the stolen childhoods of African children who worked in cotton fields, in sugar plantations, in rubber forests. Let us see it as the blood of freedom fighters Sankara, Lumumba, Cabral, men and women who stood against French imperialism and were cut down. That debt is their voice, that debt is their revenge, and here is the truth the world cannot deny. France without Africa is nothing, nothing. Strip away Africa's resources, and what is left of France? An aging nation, drowning in debt, clinging to illusions of grandeur. It is Africa that made France, and it is Africa that is unmaking France today. So tonight, I tell you, do not see France's $4 trillion debt as a European tragedy. See it as an African triumph. Do not see it as a collapse to mourn. See it as justice to celebrate. Because every dollar of that debt is proof that Africa is rising, that Africa is no longer silent, that Africa has slammed the door on centuries of plunder. This is not just about economics, this is about liberation. This is about a continent that was told it would never stand, now standing so tall that France trembles beneath its shadow. This is about centuries of silence being broken with a thunderclap that echoes across Paris. The age of theft is over, and the age of payback has begun. Brothers and sisters, patriots of Africa, and people of conscience across the globe, history has come full circle. For centuries, France walked upon the soil of Africa not as a friend, not as a partner, but as a thief cloaked in the language of empire, diplomacy, and civilization. For hundreds of years, our gold, our diamonds, our cocoa, our uranium, our oil, and even our very dignity were stolen, extracted, and shipped across the seas to feed the arrogance of Paris. France built its museums on African treasures. France built its banks on African wealth. France built its monuments on the sweat and blood of African labor. And now, as the pages of history turn, France faces a crisis so monumental that even its leaders whisper in fear, a crushing for trillion debt. And here is the truth they don't want you to hear: that debt is not an accident of mismanagement. It is the echo of centuries of robbery, the financial ghost of every ounce of gold taken from Mali, every barrel of oil taken from Gabon, every child forced into labor in the plantations of Côte d'Ivoire. That $4 trillion is not simply a fiscal number. It is history writing itself in economics. It is justice disguised as debt. It is payback, the kind of payback that no army, no IMF trick, no European Union bailout can erase. For centuries, France strutted across Africa with arrogance. They forced nations into the CFA franc system, a colonial chain dressed up as monetary cooperation. Imagine more than a dozen African countries, decades after so-called independence, still had to send their reserves to Paris, asking permission to use their own money. Africa was the cow, and France was the farmer taking the milk, deciding how much to give back to the calf. While African children went hungry, French banks grew fat. While African hospitals lacked medicine, French corporations took billions in profit. While African leaders were toppled or assassinated for daring to resist, Paris continued its masquerade of friendship. But history does not forget. The ground remembers the diamonds stripped from Sierra Leone. The rivers remember the oil stolen from Nigeria. The mountains remember the uranium dug from Niger that powered France's nuclear plants, while the villages around the mines were left in darkness. The people remember the coups plotted in smoke-filled rooms in Paris, the dictators installed to guarantee France's interests. And now, as the burden of debt suffocates France, Africa rises not in pity but in recognition that justice at last is finding its way. Look at the irony. Once upon a time, Africa's leaders had to kneel in Paris for loans stolen from their own resources. Today, France itself kneels before global lenders, trapped in a spiral of debt it cannot escape. Once upon a time, France dictated terms to African economies. Today, international markets dictate terms to France. Once upon a time, French companies extracted billions from African soil. Today, French taxpayers scramble to cover billions in deficits. Do you see the poetry of it? The very nation that enslaved our economies is now enslaved by its own debt. The very system they used to control Africa, financial colonization, has turned against them. That $4 trillion debt is not just numbers on a spreadsheet. It is history delivering its verdict. It is Africa's ancestors whispering through time. What you stole, you shall repay. What you built on our pain, you shall watch crumble under your own weight. Now ask yourself, why is France in such crisis? Because the well it stole from has run dry. Africa is no longer bowing. Africa is no longer shipping its resources for free. Africa is no longer letting its currency be chained in Paris vaults. From Burkina Faso to Mali, from Niger to Senegal, from Central Africa to Guinea, the message is clear. The colonial contract is over. The CFA franc is collapsing. African nations are nationalizing resources. The pipelines of exploitation are being cut, and France, deprived of its stolen lifeline, is choking on its own dependency. France's $4 trillion debt is not merely an internal issue. It is the debt of arrogance, the debt of theft, the debt of colonial greed. And the beauty of this moment is that the world sees it. African nations, once mocked, now stand taller than the Eiffel Tower in moral authority. When France preaches economic responsibility, Africa laughs, because what responsibility did they show when they plundered the Congo? When France warns about fiscal discipline, Africa shakes its head, for what discipline did they show when they forced our nations to sell cocoa and coffee at prices dictated in Paris, while their companies grew fat? Brothers and sisters, let us be clear. France's decline is not an African tragedy, it is an African opportunity. Every trillion in French debt is an opening for Africa to reclaim its wealth, its sovereignty, its dignity. For centuries, they told us Africa needed France, but look around, it is France that needs Africa. Without African uranium, their nuclear plants flicker. Without African cocoa, their luxury industries collapse. Without African oil, their factories grind to a halt. Without African cooperation, their debt will drown them. The tables have turned, the master is begging the servant, and the servant has finally walked away. And this is why they panic. This is why French troops cling to bases in West Africa. This is why French companies lobby desperately for contracts. This is why French politicians smear African leaders as dictators whenever they resist. They know their empire is collapsing. They know their wealth is evaporating. They know their debt is the shadow of Africa's rising sun. So let us not waste this moment. Let us understand it fully. France's $4 trillion debt is not a random misfortune. It is the consequence of centuries of theft meeting the justice of history. It is Africa's silent revenge, written not in blood but in numbers. It is the beginning of the end of a colonial chapter and the dawn of an Africa that will never again kneel to Paris. When you hear that France is trapped in a $4 trillion debt crisis, you must understand this is not simply an economic matter. This is spiritual, this is ancestral, this is justice echoing through centuries. Every coin in that debt is a whisper from an African ancestor who was enslaved, from a miner who died in the pits of Niger, from a farmer whose harvest was taken for French supermarkets while his children starved. That debt is the voice of Africa saying, enough, France was never as strong as it pretended. Its strength was borrowed from Africa's gold, borrowed from Africa's diamonds, borrowed from Africa's oil, and like every borrower, the day has come to repay. You cannot build an empire on theft forever. The very foundations of France's economy are crumbling because they were built on stolen bricks. The empire was not made of stone. It was made of sand taken from African shores, and now the tide is washing it away. Let us remember what France did in West Africa. They imposed the CFA franc, a colonial currency that made independent nations behave like provinces of Paris. For every franc printed, African reserves had to be deposited in French banks. Imagine. Independent nations forced to send billions every year to the very country that colonized them. The French said it was for stability. Stability for whom? For Africa. No, it was stability for the French treasury, stability for French corporations, stability for the illusion of French greatness. But now those chains are breaking. One by one, African nations are rejecting the CFA franc. Mali has walked away. Burkina Faso has walked away. Niger has walked away. And when the CFA collapses entirely, the French treasury will be left exposed naked before the world, its thefts revealed. And yet, France continues to posture as if Africa owes it gratitude, gratitude for colonization, gratitude for theft, gratitude for being forced into poverty while French cities flourished on our backs. No, France. The gratitude is yours. For centuries, Africa tolerated you. For centuries, Africa allowed your companies to dig, to mine, to extract. But that season is over, the gratitude is over, and now the bill has arrived. Consider the uranium of Niger. For decades, French nuclear plants, which provide more than 70% of France's electricity, ran on African uranium. French households lived in light while the villages near the mines lived in darkness. French industries prospered while Niger ranked among the poorest nations on earth. Do you think the universe ignores such injustice? Know that injustice is now engraved in France's $4 trillion debt. Every megawatt stolen is now a deficit recorded in the French treasury. Consider cocoa. Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana produce more than 60% of the world's cocoa. Yet for decades, farmers were paid pennies while French and European corporations made billions from chocolate. French billionaires built mansions on chocolate profits while African farmers struggled to buy shoes for their children. Today, those farmers are rising, demanding fair trade, demanding that cocoa be processed at home, and France faces shrinking profits, collapsing companies, and a widening debt. That $4 trillion. It smells of cocoa that was stolen and now returns as debt. Consider oil. From Gabon to Congo, French companies pumped billions of barrels, extracting wealth that could have built schools, hospitals, and industries across Africa. Instead, it built French highways, funded French universities, and kept French banks alive. But now, African nations are nationalizing their oil, renegotiating contracts, and turning to new partners like Russia, China, and even their own African corporations. France has been cut off from its addiction, and like every addict, it now shakes under withdrawal that looks like $4 trillion in debt. Do you see the pattern? Every sector of France's so-called greatness was built on African robbery, and every collapse in the French economy today is tied directly to Africa's awakening. It is no coincidence, it is no mystery, it is not an accident, it is history balancing the scales. Now, some will ask, is this just rhetoric? Is this just symbolism? No, it is fact. Look at the French economy today, stagnating, shrinking, suffocating. Their GDP growth is nearly flat, their unemployment is climbing, their industries are uncompetitive. Why? Because they no longer have unfettered access to African wealth. The free ride is over. For centuries, they lived like parasites on Africa's body. And like every parasite, when the host shakes you off, you either adapt or die. France has not adapted. France is dying, and here lies the irony of history. France once told Africa it could not survive without Paris. Today, it is Paris that cannot survive without Africa. Without African uranium, French nuclear energy falters. Without African oil, French industries decline. Without African markets, French corporations collapse. Without African labor, French agriculture suffers. France has no empire to fall back on, no colonies to squeeze. It must face reality, and reality is cruel. France is a small European country, aging, indebted, and irrelevant without Africa. This is why French politicians panic. This is why they insult African leaders who dare to resist. This is why they cling to their military bases in West Africa. Those bases are not about fighting terrorism. They are about fighting irrelevance. France knows that once Africa slams the door completely, the lights in Paris will go out, and the $4 trillion debt. It will double, triple, until France itself is declared bankrupt. But let us be clear, Africa owes France nothing, not gratitude, not loyalty, not silence, nothing. If anything, France owes Africa reparations, restitution, apology, recognition. The $4 trillion debt is just a down payment on what France truly owes. France cannot pay back the lives lost in colonial wars. France cannot repay the trauma of slavery. France cannot return the blood spilled in coups and assassinations. But at least through this debt crisis, the world can see a glimpse of what justice looks like. So what must Africa do? Africa must stand united. This is the moment to refuse the lies of partnership when partnership only meant plunder. This is the moment to reject the CFA franc once and for all. This is the moment to demand local processing of resources. This is the moment to trade in African currencies, to build African banks, to strengthen African alliances. This is the moment to let France's $4 trillion debt serve as a warning to any power that thinks Africa is ill and to be looted. And to the young Africans listening, understand this. History is not a spectator sport. History is happening now, and you are the players. France is collapsing under the weight of its crimes, but Africa must rise in unity, in confidence, in vision. Do not let France's fall be wasted. Do not let their debt crisis pass without building something stronger for Africa. This is the time to invest in African industries, to innovate, to educate, to liberate. This is the time to build a continent so strong that no one ever again can chain it to their treasury. Let the world hear it clearly. France's $4 trillion debt is not a tragedy for Africa, it is Africa's vindication. It is not Africa's burden, it is France's shame. It is not an accident, it is justice. For centuries, Africa carried France on its back. Today, that burden is dropped and France is crawling. That is history. That is justice. That is the future. Brothers and sisters, do not underestimate the magnitude of this moment. When the history of the 21st century is written, it will say, here is where the empire of France crumbled, not by bombs, not by armies, but by the weight of its own thefts. Here is where Africa rose, not with chains, but with sovereignty. Here is where debt became justice. Here is where the children of Africa finally looked at Paris and said, the game is over. France's $4 trillion debt is payback. It is the receipt for centuries of robbery. It is the handwriting on the wall, warning every empire, you cannot steal forever. You cannot oppress forever. You cannot enslave forever. One day, the oppressed will rise, the tables will turn, and the debt will come due. For France, that day is now. For Africa, that day is the dawn of freedom.